Hi everyone, magandang gabi and thanks for being here. I am Sai and I will be moderating tonight's Kuwento-Kuwentuhan. So I hope you've seen the video, but if not, so we're diving into a really timely and exciting conversation tonight, the political power of millennials and Gen Z, especially when it comes to big issues like corruption, political dynasties, and the health of Philippine democracy. In the 2025 Philippine midterm elections, something big happened. So young voters who now make up about 60% of the voting population not only turned out in huge numbers, they made waves. So if you remember, a lot of TikTok campaigns you've seen on social media, from TikTok campaigns, Facebook, social media to powerful grassroots organizing, they didn't just participate; they helped reshape the political playing field, so to speak. No, so today we're asking, what does this shift mean for the future of our politics, and what kind of leadership are these generations demanding and creating, and how is this changing the way we think about civic engagement in the Philippines? So now tonight we're really in for a treat because we have a lineup of voices in this virtual room. So first, we are incredibly lucky to be joined by Kiko Aquino D. Many of you will recognize the name. Kiko is the fifth grandchild of Ninoy and Cory Aquino, but beyond that legacy, he brings his own powerful voice to today's conversation. He currently serves as the executive director of the Ninoy and Cory Aquino Foundation and also co-convener of Tindig Pilipinas, the organizer of the 1 trillion march that happened in 21st of September. On top of that, he's shaping minds as a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at UP Diliman. So we're excited to hear his take on where young Filipinos are taking our democracy. And joining him tonight are two distinguished reactors who bring sharp insight and rich perspective to the table. So we have Jordan Shea. He is an award-winning Filipino-Australian playwright who's made his mark across both theater and television. His current play, Malacanang Made Us, now showing at Queensland Theatre Company, takes powerful look at the 1986 people power revolution through art that resonates across generations. And we're also joined by Athena Sharain Ash Presto, a doctoral researcher at the Australian National University, where she focuses on political sociology, gender, and social policy. You may have read her sharp commentary on current issues in international outlets like Time, the BBC, and The Guardian, as well as local platforms like Rappler, Inquirer, and the Philippine Star. So this is a powerful panel, and we're thrilled to have them with us to unpack tonight's timely and important discussion. So let's get into it. So we'll have Kiko first to start the conversation.
Thank you very much, Misa, and good evening or afternoon or maybe morning to everyone who's watching from whatever part of the world. So I was asked to discuss around these themes, no? So democracy, corruption, political dynasties, which is a particularly hot topic here in the Philippines, and how does the youth broadly understood to be millennials and Gen Z, although we millennials are kind of growing out of that youth tag already. How does this new generation of Filipinos sort of factor into these themes, no? So basically I plan to share what I think about democracy, informed a bit about from life experience, but also a bit from my training in political science. How do we think of about corruption within the framework of democracy? How do political dynasties sort of interact with corruption? How do they basically make corruption much more complicated compared to say maybe other places? And lastly, yun, how do the youth factor in, at least as far as the Philippines is concerned, and maybe not just the Philippines, but what are the trends we're seeing around the world? So to start with, I'd like to share my understanding of democracy, which is that it has three key elements to it. No, the first element is actually one that I think is getting a bad rap now, but I do think it's still a core part of democracy, and that's the idea that democracy is populist. No, so I think nowadays populism and democracy are being placed at odds with each other. But I think it's important to recognize that the original idea of democracy is that it's governance according to the will of the people, right? And so I don't think I think any system that claims to be democratic still needs to be able to argue that it is aligned with the general will, however defined. And it can be very complicated to figure out what that general will is. The second element, I think, is that democracy is Republican, not in the American political party sense, but Republican in the sense that it's not monarchic. It means that we do things ourselves, or we govern ourselves. No, the people take an active role in our governance, right? So it's not just that the government does what we want, which is the populist aspect, but the Republican aspect is that we ourselves are involved in the governance of our country, of our state, of our city state, if you want to go back all the way to the Greeks. And then the last element is actually the newest element, but I think it's the historically, but I think it's the one that is most associated with democracy today, and it is the you can call it a number of things, but I call it the liberal part of democracy. And the idea of the liberal part of democracy is that yes, the people government will act according to what the people want. Yes, the people will be directly involved in government, but there are certain things that government cannot do, and this involves the protection of certain individual rights. No, so the rights to I think of it as the rights to life, liberty, and property are sacred in that order. No, the most important thing is that we don't kill each other. Hopefully, we're free to do whatever we want, and whatever we sort of combine our labor with, whatever we exert our work on, we have some entitlement to that, right? So these are, to me, the three elements of what we now of democracy that you need to have, or that needs to be present in any kind of state that claims to be a democracy. So when we think of corruption, then corruption is very much a problem in the sense of the liberal aspect, right? In the sense of it is violating basically our property rights. No, we're paying our taxes, and we're paying our taxes, and it's going to a place that's not for the benefit of the people. And I think it is a particular problem now in the modern context of, we have electoral democracies, we have representatives who are in charge of us. They have a sort of disproportion. There are certain people who will occupy places in government, our congressmen, our senators, our bureaucrats, our presidents, who occupy a place in government that gives them power over us and gives them access to more information than we have, right? And this is why corruption is possible, because we're not able to observe everything that our politicians do. And even if we were able to observe all of that, we don't have all of the information that they have. And so it's hard to tell whether a certain action is corrupt, although I think the corruption in the Philippines is quite blatant. So I think it's fairly easy to tell that it's corrupt now. But in the best cases, no, or in theory, corruption occurs because of this information disparity between people, right? Between citizens of a state and the leaders of the state, right? So there's a disparity of information. Now, supposedly, the way that a democracy deals with that is that we subject our leaders to regular electoral exercises. Our leaders have to come back to the people to seek our mandate again. And if in our assessment they acted in a way that was contrary to the interests of the people, if they were corrupt, no, the idea of a democracy is that okay, they might be able to be corrupt for a few years in office. Definitely, we file charges and we have the institutional checks, the laws to prevent corruption. But ultimately, they will have to face the will of the people in 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever the span of the term is. They have to come back to us. And if they were corrupt, the people should then punish them in the election by not re-electing them, not bringing them back to power. And I think if you come from basically any sort of democratic country, you can see how, while that might make some sense intuitively, that doesn't really happen in most countries, and the Philippines is not an exception. There are very many reasons why corrupt politicians somehow still keep getting reelected. There are partisan biases, there's misinformation, there's all sorts of things. And in the Philippines, one of the things that we have to contend with here are political dynasties. No, so dynasties are. I think there's a lot of debate about how there's a lot of debate about how to define a dynasty, and there are questions about what families in politics are dynastic, what families are not dynastic. I tend to have a very just loose definition of dynasties, which is, if there is a family is that's a frequent presence in our politics, then I think you can think of that as a dynasty. So, and that's not exclusive to the Philippines. You can look at like the Bushes or the Clintons in the US, and then, um, here in the Philippines, you have very, very many names. No, it's while it's not an exclusive phenomenon to the Philippines, it is ubiquitous in the Philippines. Like you cannot go anywhere without encountering a dynasty. And I think the way that dynasties sort of interact with corruption is that the idea of sort of voting someone out is that when we see someone who is corrupt, the idea is we kick them out. We do not vote for them in the coming election, right? And we're supposed to do that in a way that's unbiased, right? So we see corruption, we kick it out. But then all of these biases float in, right? There's biases from partisan identification, there's biases from whatever other thing. But in the Philippines, one very, very strong sort of counterforce to that desire to kick out corruption is the strength of political dynasties. And part of that has to do with the hollowing out of alternatives, right? Because while we have term limits in the Philippines, now for most positions there's like a 3-term limit. For the Senate, it's a 2-term limit, and then for the president, it's just a single term, right? But for most local positions, there's a 3-term limit there. But say dynasts are able to sort of replicate the incumbency advantage that they enjoy while in office by fielding a direct relative to take their place, right? So if you think that at the end of, say, three-year terms, so at the end of 9 years, there's an open seat, um there's an opportunity for new blood to sort of contest the seat that's being held. In fact, the incumbency advantage becomes nearly perpetual because you have a dynast in place, and that incumbency advantage plays can take the form of sort of just above board things. No, you have greater name recall. There are people who I just attended a meeting on discussions on the anti-political dynasty bill, and you hear a lot of and advocates are frustrated because when they talk to people on the ground, I'm a fairly recent advocate of the anti-dynasty bill, but when they would talk to people on the ground, they would say, no, we need Mayor X there, no, or sana kamag-anak o anak o asawa o kapatid ni Mayor Y yung tatakbo ulit para tuloy-tuloy yung mga nagawa niya, right? So there's the above board side of dynasties is you have not just name recall, but people form very strong attachments to particular names here in the Philippines. And then the below board aspect of it is dynasties become this vehicle for massive corruption, right? So um aside from aside from the sort of, what do we say, the very blatant ways that it expresses itself, right? So in terms of like a family enterprise, you look at President Marcos. His cousin until recently was speaker of the house, his son became the majority leader. His sister, although he's at odds with his sister, is a senator of the Philippines. You have the Dutertes, who the father was president, Sara Duterte was mayor, one of her brothers was their district representative. When Duterte ended his term, Sara Duterte became vice president. one of her brothers became mayor, her other brother became a district representative, and then I think they have relatives in other places in Davao. So you have all of these um, different seats being occupied by a single family, and these seats are supposed to serve as checks on each other. So that gets that that sort of undermines sort of checks and balances. And the other aspect of it is, when if people see a dynasty on the ballot, no, um, whether because they have an attachment to the dynasty, or whether it's because there's some kind of vote buying going on where the dynasty sort of, because it's entrenched and it's able to have a lot of access to the economic resources of a place, they're able to spend a lot of money to buy votes during elections, and that's something that's they considered a matter of fact in the Philippines, that vote buying happens, or whether it's through intimidation, because dynasties have also access to a strong political machinery. And aside from doing traditional campaigning, that machinery can be used to intimidate voters. That gives dynasties a strong advantage over any other candidate when it comes to when it comes to the electoral exercise, and that undermines the function of elections, which is to punish corruption. This is why I think it's interesting that in the Philippines, political dynasties the term political dynasties is in the Philippine Constitution, and supposedly we've banned political dynasties in the 1987 Constitution, but it was left to Congress to decide what constitutes a political dynasty. And perhaps this is something our framers should have realized, but they never thought to define what those dynasties are, since the majority of them come from these dynasties themselves. So this makes the idea of coming up with like an anti-dynasty law definitely an uphill climb in the Philippines. That's why I think we're the movement right now is looking at exploring the idea of doing it through a referendum. We call it the People's Initiative here in the Philippines. Although the law surrounding the referendum tends to be prohibitively difficult to execute. It's never been applied, I think, before in our history. So if we were to do that for the anti-political dynasty law, it would be the first time, right? But sort of circling back, right? So the idea of a democracy is that we're supposed to govern ourselves, right? And political dynasties fly in the face of that. The idea of a democracy is that our property rights are supposed to be protected, and corruption enabled by political dynasties get in the way of that. And the idea of democracy is that the people get what they want, and it's kind of hard to imagine dynasties as being what people want. Right. So, moving on from those three topics, which are sort of these perennial problems in Philippine politics, we then talk about. I then want to think about the millennial and Gen Z generations, which are considered like the youth here in the Philippines. I'll admit that I'm not really an expert on youth politics or activism. I think see Prof. Ash might be able to say more as a sociologist, but just speaking from my personal experience, I tend to think of millennials and Gen Z as actually quite different. Maybe it's because I'm a Gen Z and then or I'm a millennial rather, and then the Gen Z are my students, and then there's some gap there. But I feel like sorry, I might be running out of time, but just very quickly, I think millennials grew up in the 90s, and the promise of the 90s was there's a lot of progress around the world, parang the end of the Cold War. You saw progress in all of these different Western countries, and then here in the Philippines, it was the promise of the post-EDSA period. And I feel like millennials grew up during this time, and um, or millennials grew up during this time, and we got the sense that things work out, the world is in a positive direction, even if we don't and this might be more my personal experience rather than representative, but even if we don't act, things will sort of work themselves out, right? So, and I think what millennials have had to come to terms with is in the last decade, that's not been the case. The world has been moving, I think, for a lot of us in a direction that we don't feel is the right one. All of these different countries of the world have been moving in that direction, and so I think um, a lot of millennial activism is getting out of that complacency of things will get better. Or at least for me personally, a lot of my current activism is getting over that idea that I thought the world was going to be better, and getting over that sense of entitlement over this better world, and figuring out that, okay, this is a problem. It's not going to fix itself if we're not going to be active. I think the Gen Z experience is very different, no, because the Gen Z came of age during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so they were robbed of a lot of particular life experiences. Here in the Philippines, it's notable that the Gen Z here went through we're the first I think we're the first generation to go through the K to 12 reform. And despite and in contrast with like the promise of better employment, they went to college, they ended up having to graduate during the pandemic, and they were faced with really, really negative job prospects at the end of it. So I think here, at least here in the Philippines, and it seems around the world, there's the sense I get of Gen Z is that they have a real chip on their shoulder, and they feel that the system, as opposed to myself as a millennial that thought things were progressing, when I was growing up. When the Gen Z people were my age, they see the system failing all around them. And so there's a real anger that comes as a result of that. And they're looking at political dynasties here in the Philippines, looking at corruption here in the Philippines, and they're seeing that democracy is not operating the way it's supposed to. So I think what we're seeing now is all around the world, a lot of these protests being led by Gen Z are taking on a much more radical form compared to, say, the protests that we might have seen a decade ago, 15 years ago, right? And just looking at how it's popping up in all of these different countries. I think the three cases that we've seen of Gen Z led protests leading to actual structural regime change in countries are Bangladesh last year, and then Madagascar and Nepal this year, right? And while I think Bangladesh and Madagascar were cases where these are countries that are not really democratic in the fullest sense, no, their elections produce a don't produce aren't contested fairly, essentially. So that one seemed to these Gen Z protests seem to be moving in a democratic direction. But then if we look at Nepal, the strange thing here is the key feature here is, as I understand it, I'm not a particular expert in Nepal, but as I understand it, their system is actually considered democratic by some minimal standards. Their elections are considered free and fair, and yet that didn't inoculate them from the rage of Gen Z, despite having a free election exercise to determine their leaders. It still didn't prevent a strong uprising to demand real change outside of the systems of government, outside of constitutional structures, when faced with corruption. So corruption is the common element in all of these things. And so here right now in the Philippines, we're facing our own moment with corruption. No? It's taking the form of flood control, and the contrast being painted is between everyday Filipinos who have to wade through flood and rat urine infested water to work, to study, versus the scions of these political families and family scions of families who own construction companies, government contractors who flaunt their wealth on social media. And I think that created this sense of rage, very similar to what we saw in like Bangladesh, in Madagascar and Nepal. I think a lot of these, and in Indonesia, a lot of these protests were triggered by some really blatant government injustice, right? The amount of a very blatant inequality, something like government is like favored seats or favored employment prospects for government officials. I think in Bangladesh favored increased benefits in some other countries, and so we're also experiencing that moment right now. And so I think it's a very big question on our minds: what direction does the mostly Gen Z led protests lead? What direction do they want to take this towards? No, is it going to be in a direction that I advocate for personally, which is to actually make our democracy operate the way it's supposed to, and use the sort of gains that we made in the midterm election to actually build an electoral movement for 2028 to kick out the corrupt politicians, in addition to filing cases against these people, and strong cases, and eventually seeing them jailed legally. We also want to I would want to see people actually humiliated basically in the 2028 elections by being kicked out by the people and electing new people to fresh faces to replace them. Is that the direction this movement is going to take, or is it going to be a more radical kind of change that we're going to see? And I think what's happening in a lot of the protests right now are negotiations, or not really negotiations in the formal sense, but a debate between these two ideas, right? And I think it remains to be seen how that debate will be resolved. So I think I took a bit more time than I was supposed to, but I'll end my comments there, and I look forward to the discussions later.
Thank you so much, Kiko. No, it was very, very meaty, and I think there's a lot of questions now, but we'd like to hear from Ash and Jordan about the reaction, especially about the role of the youth, and in terms of political participation. So can we have, maybe we can have Ash at this point?
Thank you, Tita Sai. And thanks to Kiko, very great points, indeed very meaty. I will first engage with what he mentioned, the three elements of democracy. So with regards to democracy being populist, I think we have also seen that being carefully performed by Marcos Jr. I'm thinking particularly of his Sumbong sa Pangulo platform, where he invites different citizens na magsumbong sa kanya dahil siya nga ay dakilang tagapagsugbo ng kriminalidad. With regards to democracy as Republican, we've seen Filipino people being very much involved in different socio-political issues in the Philippines. Although I think one of the main barriers would be that Filipinos are involved mostly in terms of civil society work, mostly with different non-government organizations. At nakikita natin to saan pa kundi sa mga disasters, specifically pag may baha, may bagyo, at ngayon ay may lindol. Very active ang civil society ng Pilipinas, although we have not yet, as of this moment, I think fully harnessed that very active civil society to trigger really lasting political change in the Philippines. With regards to democracy being liberal, one of the very unfortunate things that we see in the Philippines now is that because you have politicians funneling public funds towards their own pockets, hindi mo na bibigay yung serbisyo na kailangan makita ng mga Filipinos. One very critical service provision that the Philippines should be paying attention to is education. Kasi kulelat na po tayo sa PISA rankings. And the second one would be health dahil napakarami na pong nagkakasakit. And vicious cycle siya. So a lot of Filipinos are now having chronic kidney diseases dahil sa kahirapan. So ang mga kinakain ng napakaraming Pilipino ay mga delata, and ang CKD ay lifelong illness siya, which would also involve health expenditure from the government. Again, vicious cycle. And I draw on these two examples because health and education actually make up the most important human capital of a country, which we cannot invest in because our public funds are being funneled to corruption. Kiko also mentioned information asymmetry as one reason for corruption. Ang hirap makita kung sino yung mga nagbubulsa, lalo kung restricted yung information. So the ICI hearings, for example, now are being done in a closed-door manner. But I would also try to extend that to say that information asymmetry is also a reason why it's very difficult to solve corruption and governance crisis. Just because we know more about certain issues at time t than at time t plus one. So in policy world, time t plus one is just the future, time t is now. And information asymmetry can happen in many different ways. So it can happen horizontally, so between those operating in the same level, so civil society, but also at the same time, different government agencies can also be very asymmetrical in terms of its information. We see that now actually in several government agencies trying to go after corruption. Hindi na da-download masyadong information, hindi din siya available sa mga tao. So lots of horizontal, vertical information asymmetry going on in there. Why are corrupt politicians getting re-elected? This is $1 million question. Kiko mentioned patronage politics and also disinformation. I would also add regional dimensions. And in my own work, I also look into what I call loyalista mentality. So the sense is that some Filipinos actually know that the politician reigning in their local government or in their baluartes are actually corrupt. Pero dahil tingin nga nila, itong mga politiko na to, ang nakakaintindi sa kanila ay meron talaga silang certain form of political loyalty dito sa mga politiko na to. What makes the Philippines also an interesting case as compared to other countries that also have political dynasties is that the Philippines operates in such a strong bailiwick game. So labanan ng baluarte ang Pilipinas. And in fact, yung mga politiko nga na nakakatawid sa national level, sila din yung gumagawa ng sarili nilang mga baluarte. And they also build their own dynasties when they get elected into power. And this is also one of the reasons why it's very difficult to contest political dynasties, because even your dynasty breakers in the local level and also at the national level end up creating their own dynasties. I'm thinking of Manny Pacquiao, Rafi Tulfo, and also Isko Moreno. And once all of their family members or most of their family members occupy certain political positions, it not only makes having checks and balances enforced, but it also makes it very dangerous for people who want to speak up to speak up. The reason also that it's very difficult to define what a political dynasty is because of the kinship networks that we have in the Philippines. So yung mga kamag-anak mo sa Pilipinas, hindi lang yung mga kamag-anak mo by blood. In fact, in my own culture, and I was born in the rural north of Philippines, Ilocano po ako, shout out sa mga nanonood natin, mga Ilocano, is that kamag-anak mo kahit hindi mo kadugo, basta natitrace mo kung ano yung mga connection nyo. So yung ex ng boyfriend ng kapitbahay ng pinsan mo ay kamag-anak mo rin because you can trace the connections. And in fact, these kinship networks are also being mobilized by different political dynasties when they think about who to choose to run for office. Last intervention from me ay yung difference between millennials and Gen Zs. They have very different culture, politically and also socially. So I was born prematurely in December 1996. So I'd like to think of myself as Gen Z because otherwise I would have been born in late January 1997. I have different memories of Philippine politics as compared to people I know who are millennials. I also have different memories of political events in the Philippines as compared to my youngest brother, na Gen Z rin, pero 4 and so plus years younger than me. And I think it's very important to recognize these differences in collective memories kasi magkakaiba din yung response nila sa mga nangyayari sa Pilipinas ngayon. In my own work, I also saw that young people have different ways of responding to political issues. So I see it as a spectrum. So on the one hand, you have overt engagement. Dun sa kabilang end naman, meron kang calculated apathy. And then dun sa gitna, meron kang strategic engagement. Doon sa overt engagement, papasok doon yung mga protesta, especially ng mga young people na nakita natin over the last several weeks. Doon sa gitna, strategic engagement, ito yung mga creative forms of resistance that young people now perform. And napakarami dito ay social media driven. So social media driven siya, specifically using different platforms strategically. And sometimes young people would also not use their own names and faces in engaging with different people on social media. And then dun sa kabila naman, calculated apathy. I say it's calculated apathy basically because when you talk to young people, even when they say they don't participate in politics, the way that they describe why they don't like to participate in politics would still be very political. So lagi na sinasabi, ang hirap po ng buhay, wala na akong oras para magbasa pa ng news. Tingin ko kasi dapat ang mga politiko ay binibigyan kami ng sapat na suporta sa edukasyon. So meron pa ring ganong sentiments na tingin ko kasi dapat ang mga politiko ... which also already shows their political engagement, although not in an overt, public, and active manner. Doon sa gitna, strategic engagement, pinaka-favorite ng mga nakakausap kong mga kabataan, through my own research, dito yung tinatawag na bardagulan. Si bardagulan, ito yung very playful, creative, bardahan, debates, pero at the same time, inisan sa social media. Pag nakakausap ko yung mga kabataan, sinasabi nila, the more nakakainis yung banter, the better. Kasi they also want to get their points across, but in a more effective manner, which ties it back to our political culture in the Philippines, which is also very effective culturally. So all in all, I'd like to end with an optimistic but also a very careful reading of where we might be headed as a country. Social media right now has successfully facilitated rage among Filipino people. We have also seen different engagement and collaborations with among different organizations in the Philippines. Many of them are coming from different ideologies as well. But I would still make a more careful reading of our political climate, that while social media is very useful, it can also sometimes facilitate a reading that nakakatawa lang to lahat. Kasi yung social media din ay very useful siya na magpakalat ng mga memes, ng mga nangyayari, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Kasi yung memes din is a good gateway for people who would otherwise be apolitical to get to know about political issues dahil natawa sila dun sa isang meme. And also, we like that we see different interventions from the government side to curb corruption. So one of them is yung sumbong sa Pangulo, which I mentioned. But also, we have to be careful because people who are themselves painting or themselves performing as populists and as crime busters have one of the most they have the bloodiest record in Philippine history, also pocketed the most amount of public funds. And they themselves are also Nepo babies. So with that, salamat po, and I look forward to engaging with the audience and the rest of the panel.
Maraming salamat, Ash. Before we move on to give the mic to Jordan, I'd just like to read some of the questions and comments from our audience. So we have from Eileen Eugenio. Sabi niya, dynasties institutionalizes and normalizes nepotism and cronyism. And then we have a question from Mark Opao. In the bigger scheme of things, with the Philippines case as an example, do you think democracy is actually driving more corruption in the country? And another question from Chona Davidson. Hi, Kiko. Are you inspired to be an activist because you wish to continue what your grandparents and Uncle Pinoy fought for? And another comment from Eileen Eugenio. History across the world shows that corruption happens when democratic foundations are weak. So I will read the other questions and comments after Jordan's reaction.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating to hear both panelists speak so in depth about corruption within a country that my mother came to from 51 years ago, because I think she was tired of that exact reason. Obviously, I've lived in Australia all of my life, so I speak from an Australian viewpoint. And it's interesting. One of the questions relays or kind of centers corruption, within all fundamental democracies. And I think about, as an Australian case study, we have a much smaller population. We're dispersed very much throughout states and territories in this country, as many people will know. So therefore, corruption stands out very much if there is an issue of it. The media usually gets attached to it very quickly. People become very outraged, and subsequently people lose their jobs because of corruption. I can think of a number of cases, and we have great organizations here that blow the whistle on it. The other aspect that we touched upon tonight was the dynasties and intergenerational issues, and kind of facilitating oligarchies and huge cycles of the same people with the same surnames. We don't really have that. In fact, it is criticized very, very heavily. Being in the theatre myself, I come from a performing arts background. I'm a playwright who has used the 1986 People Power Revolution and EDSA as a main point for my latest play at Queensland Theatre. Nepotism is an interesting concept because it really, really does sit very much within these massive families, which we just don't really have in politics in Australia. We have it in business and we have it in arts, we have it in sport, but we don't really have dominant ones within Australian countries. In fact, I think it's within Australian political sphere. In fact, I think it's something that if it did actually happen, it would be rejected completely. And that's because of a culture of we have to make it our own way. And the sad thing from where I stand, once again, as someone who lives here and for all of his life, is that the Philippines seems to have fostered this sense of dynasty for such a long time, and it's gotten them nowhere in a way. The one thing that I get really excited about was seeing the Trillion Peso March, which actually began the day we started rehearsals for Malacanang Made Us at Queensland Theatre. That was really inspiring to me because it showed I'm like the other two panelists, I'm a millennial as well, proudly, and I teach as well. I have Gen Z students, and their language and shorthand with controversy, politics, and major issues is something I think we can all learn about. So when I see a question on Facebook about whether they can sustain the passion for the 2028 elections, that seems like such a long time away, but I guarantee that in the future years, there will be so much more to fight for. There's a line in my play that one of the young guys that lives in Queensland says, "We will always have something to fight for." And I feel that that sums up anyone who is fed up in the Philippines. And I'm always reminded that the reason that my mother came here was to foster a greater sense of self within a country and to make it her own way. It was a deeply personal constitution that she had. We weren't part of a dynasty or anything like that, but it was very much at a time, as everyone will know, in the 70s, during the Marcos era, that was a very, very tough time if you were working or middle class, which seems to have disappeared between those 13 years of martial law and 21 years of rule. So in closing, I mean, what I have to offer is not nearly as detailed as what the two other panelists have to offer, but from my understanding and from my viewpoint, is that it's never too late to be engaged for the entire diaspora around the world. We are a mighty diaspora. We are a strong diaspora, and we are one that should definitely be united on issues such as this, but not only be united, but have a complete understanding as to why Filipinos are so fed up with this, and what the Trillion Peso March means. So many people coming to our show every night don't even know about EDSA or the 1986 People Power Revolution. And that's why I wrote the play, was because I wanted people to understand what we were and how resilience and unity runs through our blood and runs through us as a people. So that's my response. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a complete privilege and honor to be sitting here and talking safely. And I feel that the anger of millennials, as Tita Melba has said, I think it's always going to continue because the rising of the digital form and social media and the quick reaction to things, the benefit of that is people get fed up very, very quickly, and long may it continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. I'd like to acknowledge our viewers here. I think we have Laling, Eileen, Janet, Rani. And I think some of the questions in the comment section was already responded to by Jordan. But there was a question directed to Kiko about what made you become an activist, Kiko.
Yeah. Sorry, see, Jordan's comments just reminded me, no. So, just a slight correction. Yung Tindig Pilipinas, hindi kami yung main organizers ng Trillion Peso March, no. So, yung lead nito ay si Bishop Colin Pagcaforo ng Caritas at siya rin ata yung, I forget the specific office sa CBCP, the Catholic Bishop Conference of the Philippines. Pero siya yung parang social action head sa CBCP currently. So yung Tindig was one of the partners through a larger coalition called Siklab, Simbahan at Komunidad Laban sa Katiwalian. And to a large extent, we're also participants. Yun, what made me want to be an activist? Siguro less, definitely it's inspired by the three, pero I think of it as less continuation and more preserving or defending. Kasi sa tingin ko, tapos na yung kwentong yun eh. I'm not trying to add anything to it. I think the phase, at least my side of the family, no, so yung Ninoy Cory line, lahat naman kami nagkakasundo na we're not really interested in being involved the same way that Lolo Ninoy or Tito Noy were involved. No, we still care very much about the country, pero yung that I think that chapter of our family's history is over, and I think of yung ginagawa ko lang yun is ayun, parang in a very visceral sense, the last the last 10 years, we've seen all of the practically everything that, at least in the case of Pinoy, practically every achievement that he had, I think, has been reversed in the last few years. No, parang look at the state of our education, the strides that we made towards health through the sin tax and the revenue that we created, it all ended up being corrupted. The peace process in the Bangsamoro is going to hell, for lack of a better term. With China, there's this back and forth when we thought that fighting for our sovereign sort of fighting for our rights to our exclusive economic zone would be something that every Filipino could rally around. And now, no, parang the gravity of corruption is even worse than the situation of the country when my tito took over in 2010 when what he said when he won on a platform of anti-corruption. So I think it's more, rather than continuing, it's just trying to remind people that there was a time that things were better. No, not perfect, definitely. But that's sort of what I'd like to. That's what I'm trying to put out there. Yeah. Miss Sai, I think you're muted po.
Thank you, Kiko. Sorry. Yes, I actually have a question for the three of you. So, what do you think are effective strategies of Gen Z and millennials that we should emulate or reproduce?
If I can start, no, I think we shouldn't shy away from anger, no. And I
Mm.
think in the Philippines at least, parang kinasanayan natin yung, okay, handog ng Pilipino sa mundo, ngumingiti tayong lahat, mapayapang paraan ng pagbabago. And that's still something I think I believe in very strongly, na I believe in active nonviolence and peaceful protest. Pero tama naman talagang magalit sa ganitong panahon eh. And I think it's wrong to respond with that, saying that anger is not the way. No, parang we're seeing all of this attention called to the issue of corruption because of the righteous anger of people. So I think while ako, let's not while hopefully we can direct it in a way that is not destructive. I think that anger first is very real, and I think we've seen its power. No? So siguro yun yung that anger and passion that I see more from Gen Z. I think for me personally is very inspiring and something I try to emulate also.
Can we have Ash and Jordan?
Ay, parang ang
So,
hirap
what do you
niyan,
think
Tita
are
Sai.
effective strategies of yeah?
Yeah. So ang hirap dyan, Tita Sai, because primarily because I don't think Gen Zs are doing something radically different with how they respond to political issues. And I have to put a caveat here, na kapag sinabi ko I don't think they're doing something different, ay wala silang ginagawa. In fact, on the contrary, ang dami na nang ginagawa. And it's very heartening to see how what they're doing now also harks back to what young people in the 1970s and 1980s, during the darkest times of Philippine history, were doing. So yung mga kabataan, nung 1970s, 1980s, galit din sila ngayon eh. Ay, galit din sila eh. So isa sa mga una kong natutunang social movements when I was still studying in UP was the First Quarter Storm. For example, kung saan nakaisa yung mga estudyante ng mga kabataan sa laban ng mga manggagawa. In terms of pagtindig sa laban ng mga manggagawa, nakikita din natin yan sa ginagawa ng mga kabataan dahil hanggang ngayon ay meron pang mga panggigipit sa mga transport workers natin, among so many other sectors. And yung creativity of their responses, even nung mga naunang mga dekada, ay very creative na rin yung mga kabataan. And in fact, napakaraming nakikipag-usap pa rin ng mga dating kabataang aktivista sa mga kasalukuyang kabataang aktivista para ma-ensure yung continuity of the movement, which I think is very critical. Pero yung context ng mga kabataan ngayon, especially with social media, siguro doon ako magla-latch on kasi wala namang social media nung mga nakaraang dekada. Although meron ng iba't ibang klase ng mga media engagements. So nung EDSA DOS, for example, gamit din nila yung mga cellphones nila. Now, ang daming mga pwedeng gawin sa technology. So, yung sinabi ko kanina, nagagamit sila ng mga alternative social media accounts, not using primarily their own faces and their own names kasi delikado rin sa kanila, especially if their parents don't want them to be so involved in politics. But they'll still find ways to engage even if they don't use their own actual names. Nakita ko rin ngayon yung arts oriented approach ng mga kabataan. So I'm a fan of drag as an artistic expression, and I also see a lot of drag artists performing in different social movements, which is again very heartening to see. There's also a lot of singing and also drawing, different kinds of reaching out to different sectors also. And I think I'd like to end with a note that I see young people now are still trying to reach out to different sectors that would otherwise be constrained to politically participate. And I'm thinking about those from outside Metro Manila and those from working class background. And I'm very passionate about this because I myself also comes from that sector. So I was born in the provinces in the northern Philippines from working class families. My father was a bus conductor nung nagtatrabaho pa siya. So malaking bagay sa akin na makita na merong effort to reach out to those sectors at sana ipagtuloy-tuloy at ipaghigihan pa. Ayun lang po, salamat.
Okay. Jordan, do you have something to say about that question?
Yeah, I just also want to go off Ash's point about the arts as a point of education. I'm seeing it very much in my own process and own work. I think drag is a fabulous vehicle and vessel to as a point of activism as well, and it's so embraced through the intersection of social media and Gen Z. It's interesting, Gen Z. For me, so I to still talk about my play at the moment because obviously that's kind of my main viewpoint here. Malacanang Made Us is about two brothers that were revolutionaries in the 1986 EDSA revolution, and then it's about a Gen Z activist during 2022 during Bongbong Marcos's election. So it all takes place in both Australia, in Brisbane, and then Manila on EDSA in 86. So it's two timelines that kind of interweave with each other. And what's really interesting is that I've tried to emphasize that a lot has changed because it's really, for me, 1986 was from a outsider's perspective, and I know many people that were there, was very much boots on the ground. They were there, they were ready. They obviously didn't have the internet, which is probably a better thing now. I think the internet can be a bit of a double-edged sword. And additionally, I think now Gen Z having the internet, it's power, and they're reclaiming it and using it as power. And that anger that Kiko talked about is really, really interesting because often I think anger, as he said, should not be destructive. It should be pragmatic anger. you should know what you're fighting for. And that's really what I have to say about that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan. I think we need to extend this discussion for about 15 minutes if that's okay. And just to let our audience know, because napaka interesting at ang dami nating gustong sabihin. I'm sure ang daming gustong sabihin ng ating mga speakers. Just going back to what Kiko said about being angry, yung mga kabataan natin ay galit and it's okay to be angry. My question is, should we or can we avoid violence then? And are the and how can we, how can we avoid? Is it through election? And are Gen Z and millennials more attracted to revolutionary government than elections? Wasn't EDSA a kind of revolutionary government?
I guess just responding knee-jerk to what you've asked, no. I think definitely hindi lang dito sa Pinas pero sa different countries that I observe. Parang
Yeah.
the sense that I get is that younger generations are less interested in yung established institutions, no. Yung Gen Z in particular na whether they're on the left or on the right of politics, parang there's a rejection of what's perceived as the establishment compared to previous generations. And maybe baka that's not unique to Gen Z, baka that's a function of that's maybe common across all young people. Pero sa tingin ko at the very least in Gen Z though, I can understand kung ano yung pinaghuhugutan nila sa rejection nila na ayun, parang we had a COVID-19 pandemic that robbed them of a particular part of their formative years. And yun, dito sa Pilipinas, parang, and I think around the world, we've seen yun, a lot of governments act in ways that are contrary to their interests, no? Parang yung feeling nila na wala silang boses. So hindi ako magtataka kung mas in a way kinatatakutan ko siya, but in a way I also understand it na um there is less faith in sort of democratic processes and institutions. Pero yun, how do we channel that? My hope is ayun, parang my hope is to bring that in the direction of an electoral movement for 2028, building on yung gains that we made, the surprising gains that at least the Democratic opposition made in 2025. But also, part of that is also we need to, we need if if especially government um doesn't want the anger that people feel right now to be translated into an existential threat. They need to meet that anger also with meaningful charges filed against these people, with transparency, as kagaya ng nabanggit ni Ash, yung pagiging closed door ng ICI is, I think, a really problematic position for the government to take. Kasi ako, speaking candidly, I feel the pressure na parang given how slowly the issue is progressing, and ako yung gusto kong mangyari is yung active nonviolence within the democratic tradition. It becomes harder and harder to make that argument if you don't see change happening with the tools that we're using, with the tools that the democratic system gives us. So yun, I think definitely I wouldn't be surprised if it moves in the direction of, say, Nepal, Madagascar. I don't recall how violent things ended up being in Bangladesh, but moving in that direction na talagang broader structural change yung mangyayari.
Yes, Jordan.
I just wanted to ask, while I've got both of you here, if that's okay, do you think that we could actually see another rally the scale of 1986? Do you ever think that maybe we could see the EDSA of the 21st century? Like, would you ever think it's possible? I mean, anything is possible.
Without being violent. Are you asking
Without being
It's always
being violent? Yeah.
violent, do
I
you
was
ever
about to
think
ask you
that
that
a
question, Jordan.
gathering of that scale could ever come back?
I think speaking, I think specifically for on my side of politics, I think a lot of us feel quite married, for lack of a better term, to the 87 Constitution. Like we have a strong attachment to it. Like this is the fruit of EDSA and sort of the system that it produced. We want to make it work as much as possible. And while I think there was the EDSA DOS that happened, though that wasn't nearly the scale of the first EDSA revolution. But I think it, it for me personally, it's very hard for me to buy into the idea of another power revolution to basically end the regime created by the 87 Constitution, which we still sort of live under. And so I think for me that makes it hard to buy into that kind of thing. Although again, I can completely understand why that idea becomes appealing to a lot of people, because we've seen these institutions sometimes despite people's best efforts, sometimes because of people's best efforts. We've seen these institutions fail us time and time again. No? So I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but at least there's a part of politics that I'm a part of that was there in 86 that maybe is hesitant to join in that kind of movement now, because we want to make that system work.
Yes. What about you, Ash? Any reaction or any insight from, from that question?
Um,
Can we or should
yeah,
we
very,
avoid being violent?
again, a very difficult question, Tita Sai, and I'd like to be very, very careful in how I answer this question because I also want to do justice to our friends, especially right now in the Philippines, who have been fighting the hardest to curb corruption. So, and within the more progressive movement too, the concept of EDSA can be quite contested, especially because EDSA as an aspiration in itself has not entirely improved the Philippines. And in fact, we do see the same system right now that also existed before EDSA 1, EDSA 2, and even EDSA 3. Um, so the EDSA model is itself contested. And in fact, one side of that debate would even say that the fact that Filipinos right now are too married to this idea of peaceful, non-violent EDSA revolutions is also something that is keeping the movement constrained. Because we cannot move away from that model. And maybe we should rethink that model because that model does actually not improve the conditions of the Philippines. So we don't know. Doon lang ako sa I'm very confused na answer. And you don't know. We hope for the best though.
Well, we have another question here from Eileen. How do you fight against the very strong cultural attitude of supporting politicians from one's own region, regardless of the actual performance and competence of that person?
It's a very good question also. Kasi even the democratic opposition, may mga baluarte din yan, 'di ba? Like we perform very well in Negros, for instance, and sabagay, I've never been there. I've never campaigned there, but I get the sense that's a legacy of yung experience nila nung panahon nung panahon ng diktadura na there was massive famine in the area. So and definitely for Leni Robredo, there's a very strong attachment to her in the Bicol region, no? So I think those parang the regional math will always be a factor in electoral politics. Hindi naman ate yan mawawala. But I think um I think in addition to that, I think it's not so much that everyone has to sort of turn their back on that kind of regional identity, because it's part of who you are. No? It's going to bias how you vote no matter what. But I think it's a question of yun, how do and I think we saw some success here in 2025. No, it's how do we, taking into consideration these regional aspects, how do we sort of draw a map of the country that's viable for a sort of more progressive candidate? No, parang I think yung term after 10 years of political science, parang nitong taon ko lang narinig yung Lingayen Lucena corridor na apparently that's the key to winning a lot of elections. So I think we're learning and we're swiftly learning to make sense of these regional biases, not eliminate them, but at least tell a narrative tell a narrative for a campaign that can resonate with with these parang with these particular concerns in different regions.
Yeah. Any other reaction or response to that question?
Ako, Tita Sai, I have a may dagdag ako kay Kiko. Okay, ako kay Kiko na mahirap talaga siya. And maybe we might not want to because it's not necessarily a bad thing to culturally identify with a certain politicians. I would even say that it actually can be a strength, especially in an archipelagic Philippines, to have people coming from different places, also conversing and making decisions politically as equals. So maybe an approach can be that when we talk about these corrupt politicians, we also highlight some of the aspects of cultural identities or some regional personalities also that are not corrupt, and also work our way towards conversing in a more culturally sensitive manner. So, for example, for me, bilang my first language is Ilocano, I also do know people who, from my own community, who would rather speak in English than speak Ilocano. Kasi pag Ilocano kami, meron kaming punto. And sometimes because they have the accent, they also get discriminated against. And some politicians, we've seen some national level politicians, very populist ones at that, even hang on to these accents para sabihin na, "Uy, pinapakita kong kalugar ko kayo, suportahan niyo ako at pare-parehas tayo, hindi discriminate." So what if mas maging bukas tayo dun sa ganung mga cultural diversities, but also at the same time being very transparent about our expectations for our politicians. So easier said than done, but I think mas sustainable siya kaysa dun sa i-disaggregate mo culturally yung mga tao dun sa kanilang mga political choices. And last na siguro, Tita Sai, sometimes culture is also very difficult to rationalize. So by the nature of culture itself, tapos rational yung approach mo dun sa something that's very traditional, also passed from generations to generations, ang hirap nun. And we've seen na yung ganong mas irrational, and I don't mean it negatively, na dimension ng Philippine politics right now, mas kaya siyang i-maneuver at i-manipulate ng mga more nefarious forces kesa dun sa mga gustong mag-mainstream ng democracy. Ayun, thank you po.
Okay, we have a question from Melba. As millennials, do you see your generation supporting specific candidates in 2028? This is particularly for Kiko and Ash.
Yeah. I think I definitely the 2025 midterm, parang yung popular na narrative dito ay yun Gen Z election siya, na parang marami nanalo na kandidato na dinala ng Gen Z, and that's definitely part of the story, but to the best of my understanding, it's not the whole story yet. O parang definitely we saw yung mga kandidato na sinusuportahan ng Gen Z as evidenced by all of these college surveys outperforming the traditional survey firms, doing well in the election. Pero parang from what I've seen from statistical evidence, and I guess sabagay medyo na-discredit yung surveys ngayon, so baka I shouldn't be relying on that too much, pero wala, yun yung bias ko sa training ko. It's not the whole story, right? And if it were the whole story, definitely Gen Z is voting more for the candidates that I like than my fellow millennials are. kung Gen Z man yun, di ba? So I think that in terms of the millennial votes specifically, I think yun nga medyo karamihan sa amin ay hindi na youth. And ako, by the time 2028 rolls around, di na rin ako youth niyan. So I think our voting pattern seems to be a bit more similar to the average Filipino. Gen Z is a little different, but even Gen Z, doesn't like. I remember the thing that sticks in my mind is yung Pulse Asia did one last survey right before the 2025, the day of the 2025 election, na hindi nila na-publish in time for the election because it takes time to turn around. Even there, hindi pa rin nila na-predict yung final result, no? Parang I think they had. And even if you just break it down into, only going to look at Gen Z. Si Bam Aquino came in at fourth. Yung Tito Bam ko, my bias, came in at fourth, no, rather than second. So either maling-mali yung survey, which is, there's some truth to that. Kailangan, if the results are that different, there needs to be something investigated in the survey. But taking the survey at face value, hindi lang Gen Z yung nagpanalo kay Bam at Kiko. No, parang there's something more to it that I think we're still discovering. I think part of it might have to do with education. So not necessarily yung age mo, but because you went through, say, a college education. And I think more people got access to that because of the free college education, which si Tito Bam campaigned on. That might have changed some voting behaviors as well. So I think there's still a lot to really unpack as far as that election is concerned. Kasi demographics-wise, yung millennials, I don't think we voted that differently from the people who had Bongo number 1, Bato number 2, etc.
Are there any other reactions? Otherwise, I have one last question, and then I think there is maybe Jordan can answer if you're going to bring the production of Malacanang Made Us to Canberra, please. But my last
Manila.
question, yeah, yeah, last message, especially maybe to Jordan about the diaspora, the Gen Z and millennials diaspora. What, any message for them so they can, as you mentioned, iba kasi ang context dito. So how can we make them more aware or can relate to issues in the Philippines like corruption, for example,
I think,
or even organizers in the Philippines? How do we?
yeah, I mean, I follow a lot of kind of great Instagram pages that keep me up to date with kind of millennial and Gen Z context about what's going on in the Philippines. A lot of it's quite rooted in America because a lot of Filipino Americans have kind of reclaimed a lot of their culture and tried to educate and successfully other people on certain issues. And these issues range from everything from family dynamics, social dynamics to political history. I remember like going to Boston on an exchange with the Ian Potter Cultural Trust, which is a foundation in Melbourne. And I went with a friend of mine who's also Filipino, and I went and saw where Kiko's grandfather spoke and did a series of lectures. And I remember weeping and thinking this was incredible. And my friend just couldn't understand why I was so moved by this. And I had to kind of explain who he was. Which was no shame for me. It was more that there is a gap of education and learning, which was kind of reclaimed very much from literature that is both digital and textually based and written in many ways. That leads to the question of whether I could bring Malacanang Made Us to Canberra. At the moment, it will probably. I would think it would come back in 2027. I don't know where. I don't know when. But there is a following that's building because I think its foundation is that it educates not only Filipino people, but Australia on a part or chapter of history that we should be known for. Not just for, but that people should know about us. So, and also just Melba asking, do I find Filipino Americans are culturally different to Filipino Australians? I think with more, like the more you have these kind of large groups of Gen Z Filipino, because I'm a high school teacher as well, so I've seen it. When you have large groups of Filipino American Gen Zers, they're really like big and loud and impressive. And Filipino Australians, I still think, are finding their feet. But that's the beauty of it. And I still think we're going to keep going for a long time.
Ikaw naman, last message.
Yeah. Any last message now for before we finish our talk? So any last message from the three of you?
See, I guess from my end, yung nakikita natin sa Pinas ngayon, parang kakaiba siya, eh, no? I can't speak to yung experience of the 70s and 80s, no? Pero yung level ng galit na nararamdaman ng mga tao na kahit um, parang dosena lang kayo sa isang kalye tapos may signs kayo na bumusina laban sa korupsyon, and then parang feeling daan-daan ng mga kotse na dumadaan ay bumubusina. Like that kind of anger wasn't here even 3 or 4 months ago, no? And I think yun, parang there's something very real happening right now in the Philippines. And as si Prof. Ash mentioned, no, there's a debate there's not an overt debate, but in terms of people's imaginations, there's a contest over where do we bring this anger? Is it towards something, again, within the frame of the 87 Constitution and within the box of EDSA, so to speak, and that's sort of where I would like to bring all of this anger. But there's also, I think, something more radical going on, and some of that is being done in bad faith. I think there are people na you had Chavit Singson talking about church military junta, which I think is bringing back the worst parts of the martial law and immediate post martial law period. But there are also people in good faith thinking about, well, one by one, we're seeing all of our institutions fail. The executive isn't doing a good job investigating these issues. Congress is purely politicized. I think there were some good things done by the current ombudsman, but you can't take away that he's also a scion of a political dynasty and everything. So I can understand how people would say we want a more wholesale kind of change. And I think the challenge on the one hand is for one, the challenge I think primarily is on the current administration, that despite the 3+ years of truly mediocre governance, they need to shape up and actually show results as far as this corruption issue is concerned, which they themselves brought up in the last State of the Nation address. But I think the challenge is also for those of us who are organizing, how do we tell a compelling story about this is what the 87 Constitution gave us. We can make this work, but it requires um it requires imagination, and it requires some courage on the part of the democratic opposition, that we need to, despite being beaten up on social media for the last decade, we need to put ourselves out there again and say that we're a credible alternative in 2028. Because if people don't see a credible alternative in 2028, that idea of a more wholesale kind of change becomes more attractive. So I think I think we're at the period right now that really anything can happen. And in a way, it's hopeful, it's also frightening, and I think and just I hope everyone hopes for the best for the Philippines, whatever the best ends up looking like.
Ash, any last minute message?
Yan. Kung iisipin ko ba ang Pilipinas, siguro Gen Z din siya. Kasi batang bansa ang Pilipinas. Tapos, fairly recently lang tayo naging independent and also naging democratic. So, mahirap talagang bumuo ng isang bansa. So, there's also a lot of space for us to improve. And sususugan ko lang yung sinabi ni Prof. Kiko kanina na we hope that everybody still hopes for the best. Whatever that best would look like. Thank you po.
Jordan, any last message?
We have a saying in Australia, keep fighting the good fight. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, we're over time now. Hindi ko na mababanggit lahat ng mga nanood, but maraming salamat. Very interesting, at tingin ko meron pang mga susunod na mga discussions tungkol sa mga kabataan ngayon, yung role nila sa challenging what's happening in the Philippines. Maraming salamat kay Kiko for giving us time. for this Kwento-Kwentuhan. Hopefully, ma-invite namin ulit dito. And also to Ash, and also to Jordan. Jordan, hopefully you can bring the Malacanang made us in Canberra and in Sydney. At again, salamat sa mga nakikinig ngayong gabi.